Oh, okay, all right. Never hurts. I want you to know that I realize that I'm not the one that you came to see tonight. I think that this will still be worth your time. What I would like to do, first of all, the AI tool that they have built for Holocaust survivors is amazing. So if you ever have a chance, please go to Mr. Lester's website. You can literally have a conversation with him. I wish we would have had this technology 30 years ago when there was a lot more survivors that were still with us, but I'm very grateful that we have that technology now because it's really preserving some memories in a very realistic virtual way. So anyway, what I propose we do tonight, since you're here, you took time out of your busy schedule to be here, is I thought that I would present some of the common questions, myths, misconceptions that people may have about the Holocaust, and just talk about it. And I would kind of like to make this informal, so as we go, if you have questions that pop up, please, just let me know, and I'm happy to stop. And at the end, when I'm done talking, if there's anybody that wants to stick around and ask more questions about maybe things that we didn't talk about, then I'm happy to do that as well. Okay, so please feel comfortable, asking questions if those questions come up.
So you teach at a high school?
Yeah, so I'm a teacher at Bountiful High School here in Davis County. I teach AP World History, U.S. History, and then I also teach a semester elective on the Holocaust. And that's something I've done for the last 2 years, but I've been teaching about the Holocaust for my entire teaching career, which is about 8 years. And as Kim mentioned, I am a museum teacher fellow at the museum. What that means is I don't work for the museum. What it means is I partner with the museum to promote Holocaust education in my local community and in the local school system as well. And they have them in all 50 states. There's 2 or 3 of us here in Utah, so I'm one of them. Yeah.
I was just going to say that the Holocaust and the Second World War happened before I was born, but there were too many witnesses that went through that. I know that the Holocaust happened, but I don't understand how there's new generations that say, oh, it never happened, it never happened.
Yeah, there is some
I don't
trouble.
understand that.
There's some troubling statistics that are coming out that show that the younger you are, the less likely you are to know about the Holocaust or to understand some of just the basic facts, which is why I do what I do, because I think preserving the memory of the Holocaust as well as the factual history of the Holocaust is important, and so that's why I teach the course on the Holocaust, and that's why I'm here tonight, is to share that information. Okay, so why don't we get started? I thought it might be useful to start off with by first coming to some agreement on just some basic definitions of terms that we commonly use when we talk about the Holocaust. And one of those is the word Holocaust itself. And depending on who you talk to, you might get a lot of different definitions that include certain things and other definitions that don't. This is the definition that the museum uses, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I have highlighted some words there in red that I wanted to kind of emphasize and maybe talk about a little bit, okay? So, what it says there is the Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million European Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators in the years leading up to and during World War II, okay? Now, let's look at some of those words that I've highlighted in red. Number one, systematic. What does that mean? It means that there was a system and an infrastructure that was created to make this possible. It was intentional. There was a plan that developed over time, and it involves state-sponsored support for that. Now, what do we mean by state-sponsored? It means that the government of Nazi Germany put this into play, right? They used all of the resources of the national government, the infrastructure, the railroads, the roads, to make this possible. And so this was not something that just kind of happened spontaneously. It was something that was planned. It was intentional. And then they designed a system to make it possible. Okay? Next, who are we talking about? Now, you see up there it says approximately 6 million Jews. I'll talk a little bit about how we got to that number a little bit later. Jews were the primary target for the Holocaust. There are other groups, and we'll talk about some of them here in just a second. But they were the primary target. They were the ones most often executed as a part of the Holocaust. Some of the other groups that were targeted may have also ended up in the concentration camps and even some of the extermination camps, but no group was targeted to the extent that Jews were. Okay? We're also talking about European Jews. Obviously, there were Jews living in other parts of the world. The Holocaust takes place in Europe, and so it affected the Jews that lived in Europe. At the time that the war began in 1939, there were about 9 million Jews living in Europe, various countries, most of them in Eastern European countries. Poland, for example, of the 9 million, Poland had 3 million Jews. Okay? The Soviet Union had somewhere around perhaps 2 million. And then the others are kind of scattered through various other Eastern European countries. In Western Europe, countries like France, Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, they all had Jewish communities, but in much smaller numbers than what you find in Eastern Europe. Okay? By the end of the Holocaust, 2 out of every 3 Jews had been murdered. Okay? So 66% of Europe's Jews is gone by the end of the war. Okay? Now, by who? Well, I've specified there the Nazi regime. I don't think that's a surprise to most of you. But I've also highlighted collaborators up there. Who are we talking about when we say collaborators? Well, that kind of brings me to the first question that I often get, which is, was Adolf Hitler responsible for the Holocaust? And the answer to that question is yes. But as is usually the case when you talk about the Holocaust, there's some very simple questions, but never simple answers. And usually the answers are a lot more complicated than that. So as far as we know, Hitler did not kill himself one single Jew or anybody else that was targeted as a part of the Holocaust. So how did this happen? Well, he had help. Help from who? Well, there of course was the infrastructure that the Nazi government set up that included the Waffen-SS, Schutzstaffel, that's kind of their Hitler's personal guard. There's also Nazi Party officials, but then it also includes German government officials who may or may not have been a part of the Nazi Party. It included the German military, but most importantly, it included ordinary people just like you and me, who in small ways, just because they performed their job and because they agreed to go along with what was being asked of them, participated in the Holocaust as well. Okay? Let me back up just a little bit. When does this happen? Well, I think most people understand that the Holocaust occurs during World War II, but we actually mark the beginning of the Holocaust in the years before the war. When Hitler first comes to power in Germany in 1933. So it's about a 12-year period if you include the years before the war and then the years of the war as well. Now, there is an extended definition because some of you are probably wondering, well, I've heard that there were other groups that were targeted as a part of the Holocaust, and you would be correct. So the museum also has an expanded definition of the Holocaust to identify who these other groups were. Okay? So it's not just Jews who are targeted, although they were the primary target. It also includes Roma and Sinti. That's a term that is referring to what used to be called gypsies. They have a population that's kind of scattered around Europe. It also includes disabled, anybody with a physical or a mental disability, and that includes a whole range of different psychological conditions, but it also included people who had epilepsy, for example. It included anybody with a physical disability. Okay? If you were born with a club foot, for example, then you could possibly have been targeted for extermination as well. It also includes a variety of different Slavic people. Yes, ma'am?
The disabled people that it included were not only ethnic, they were also German.
Yes.
The German people that did not meet the Aryan standard disability, mental abilities, they created special hospitals
Correct.
for those folks. So it wasn't just this group. They were, of course, persecuted as well, but Hitler did that to his own people.
Yeah, that's correct. When you're talking about Jews, when you're talking about disabled persons, when you're talking about socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, gay men, in all of those cases, that would have included German citizens. Okay? But because of whatever group they belonged to that was targeted by the Nazi Party, they become a persecuted group as well. Yeah. So you can see that there's quite a cross-section of victims that come from a variety of different groups. In some cases, it's because of religion. In the case of Jews, I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, because according to Nazi racial ideology, Jews were not a religion. They considered them a race of people. Okay? But it also included Jehovah's Witnesses. In some cases, Roman Catholics were targeted as well. Anybody who had any kind of, or expressed any kind of political opposition to the Nazi Party, they could have been targeted. And then, for example, socialists or communists, but also Jehovah's Witnesses. One of the reasons Jehovah's Witnesses are targeted is because, and I'm not completely familiar with the Jehovah's Witness faith, but it's my understanding that they do not swear an oath of loyalty to any earthbound government, if that makes sense. And one of the things that Adolf Hitler required was an oath of loyalty. Okay? And so they often were targeted as a result as well. Yes, ma'am?
I saw a documentary about that, the Jehovah's Witnesses. The men were rounded up and put in a prison, and there were hundreds of them. They refused to be enlisted in the German army because they were like conscientious objectors. So the men were rounded up and they were guillotined. It was this program.
Yeah, so what do we come away with from all of that? There is quite a diversity in victims, right? And so I think because of the way that the Holocaust is maybe taught, the way it's portrayed in movies and TV and popular books and so forth, you may have the impression that this is something that only affected Jews. Again, they were the primary target, but let's just also be aware that there were other groups targeted as well. Okay, a couple other definitions. First of all, anti-Semitism. I want to kind of be clear about what we mean when we use that word. Prejudice against or hatred of Jewish people. Okay? And when you ask the question, why the Jews? Again, not a simple answer, but it deals with anti-Semitism, this prejudice against and hatred of Jews. I mentioned Nazi racial ideology. This is really at the base of why the groups who are targeted are targeted. It has to do with this racial ideology. Their belief is that the world is divided up into basically two groups of races. You have certain races that they would consider to be superior. You often hear sometimes people make reference to the Aryan race. That's what they're referring to, a superior race. And then a bunch of other races that are considered to be inferior. And the history of the world is the history of a struggle between these two types of people, groups of races. Those that are considered superior and those that are considered inferior. For Nazis, the key to success in overcoming these so-called inferior races was you maintain your own racial purity. Okay? They considered Jews to be a threat to that racial purity. They considered disabled people to be a threat to that racial purity, and a few other groups as well, the Roma and the Sinti and others. So that's why these different groups become targets. It's based on this idea, this racial ideology that the Nazis had. Now, I also want to mention that Jews are not considered by the Nazis to be a religious denomination. Okay? Now, we know that that is the case. They are. There is no one stereotypical Jewish person, right? You'll find them of all varieties, races, living in all different parts of the world, but in the Nazi mind, they are not a religious denomination. They are a race. Okay? Now, what that means is, if you are identified as being Jewish, you can't not be Jewish. Does that make sense? In other words, if you are someone who had Jewish grandparents, but let's say you're not a practicing Jew, you don't go to the synagogue on Shabbat, didn't matter. As far as the Nazis were concerned, you were still a Jew. You may have even converted to Lutheranism or Roman Catholicism. Didn't matter. You were still a Jew. If you have grandparents that were Jewish, you were a Jew. Yeah?
There's one debate what actually a Jew was.
Yes. To the point that, so a lot of this is based on this kind of pseudo-scientific theory called eugenics, which is the idea that people are born with certain racial traits. They're lazy, they're prone to be criminals, they're prone to deviant behavior, and it's based on genetics. Now we know that that is false. That has been proven false over and over. But at the time, that's what the Nazis believed, and they actually tried to show that there is such a thing as a Jewish race, and they did studies looking at eye color and shape of their ears and hair color and all sorts of things. Never were able to come up with any kind of definitive list of so-called Jewish characteristics. There are stereotypes that they often used, but nothing that they could point to and say this is somebody who's Jewish. Saw a hand back there?
Was there any ratio that got them to where they weren't considered Jewish, like if you were 1/16?
Yes. Okay.
They're still Jewish, right?
So yeah, well,
Maybe.
kind of, and that's what I was getting to with your question. Because they can't find anything that physically or genetically defines somebody as Jewish, they had to come up with laws, and they were called the Nuremberg race laws. And these were laws that basically defined who's Jewish. And essentially it comes down, I'm simplifying it, but essentially it comes down to this. If all four of your grandparents are Jewish, you're Jewish. Okay? If you have one grandparent that is not Jewish, you are what's called Mischlinge, which literally means mixed race. Okay? But you are still what they would call tainted or polluted with Jewish blood, so to speak. But you aren't necessarily subject to the same kinds of discrimination and penalties that someone who is fully Jewish, four grandparents. So that's how they define it. Then they pass laws that say, who can or cannot get married based on your Jewish heritage, and it just goes on from that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
They also put together what was considered the perfect Aryan. They had specific qualifications that you had to match to be considered the perfect Aryan.
They do. And what's interesting about that is many non-Jewish Germans did not fit that perfect ideal Aryan identification. There's a really interesting case. They held a nationwide perfect Aryan baby competition, right? And people could send in photographs of their baby, and based on, I don't know, some arbitrary list of what they considered to be the perfect Aryan baby, they would of course pick, this particular baby is the perfect Aryan baby. Just so happens that the baby that they chose to win that competition was Jewish. Blonde hair, blue-eyed, beautiful, little baby, but it fit, kind of this, what you're talking about, this what they thought was kind of the stereotypical pure Aryan race. So, and I mean, if you look at Adolf Hitler, brown hair, brown eyes, doesn't fit, short, yeah, doesn't fit that Nordic kind of definition of what they thought of as being, you know, the pure race.
Goebbels had a club foot.
Yeah. So obviously this is being applied selectively, right? But what really is the, you know, the defining characteristic, at least in terms of Jews, is how many grandparents did you have? Okay. So we've talked a little bit about who's responsible. I also like to identify 4 different groups as you talk about those who participate in the Holocaust or are affected by it. One are the perpetrators. We know, and that's who these guys are, right? I should also point out, all of these groups of people that you see here, I kind of pointed them out as German, but the same groups of people in other countries would also have been involved. And that includes countries that were allied with Nazi Germany, so countries like Hungary, Austria eventually unifies with Germany. They participate in this as well, and all of the government officials in those countries would have enthusiastically, in some cases, participated as perpetrators. But it also includes countries that were invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany. So you could be talking about France. Well, it's French police that are rounding up French Jews to be deported off to the camps. Same thing happens in the Netherlands or in Belgium or any of the other countries that are invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany. They had those who collaborated. Okay? Yes?
I believe Stalin killed quite a lot of Jews himself, or had his henchmen doing it.
He was no friend of Jews either.
No.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. So that's one group, the perpetrators themselves. The second group is the collaborators. I've kind of already talked about them. There's a third group that I refer to as bystanders. They're not directly involved in carrying out the Holocaust, but they also don't oppose it either. And in some cases, bystanders would benefit from the persecution of their Jewish neighbors. They loot their apartments once they've been deported. They move into their homes, things like that. So they don't actually engage in actions that lead to the death of Jews or others, but they're also happy to take advantage of it as well. The fourth group are rescuers. And I like to talk about rescuers because it illustrates that there were other choices possible. So in all 4 of these different groups, people are making choices that are individual choices based on circumstances that they were in at the time, the countries that they were in, and everybody who participates in the Holocaust may participate for a variety of reasons. Okay? But it's incorrect for anybody to say, I didn't have a choice. Because clearly you did, because many did make that choice to be a rescuer. They helped Jews in some way, they hid them, fed them, gave them money, helped transport them to safety. So obviously there was that choice available to you.
And if they were caught, they were murdered.
Sometimes,
What,
yeah.
people?
Yeah, you're correct. And so that's why it would have been a hard decision to make, right? To assist or to rescue Jews in any way. But some still did it. So obviously that was a choice available. Very few made that choice. The overall majority of non-Jewish Europeans chose not to help. And so when you hear about a rescuer, that is an exception, right? Okay. So I wanted to just to illustrate, the various ways in which people collaborated. Okay, this is the personal identification document for a Jewish woman. This is in Belgium, so this is not a document that was produced by the Nazis. This is produced by the Belgian government, and you can see stamped on her identification card there in bright, big, bold red letters the words Juif and Jood, which is French and Flemish. Belgium, they speak both languages, for Jew, right? So she is identified as a Jew on her personal identification card. Okay? That took the cooperation of local officials, right? They didn't have to, they chose to in some cases. All right. It also includes just people who are doing their job, railroad workers, for example. In this particular case, this is Stefan Kucharek, and he is a railroad engineer. He drove trains, but he also drove the trains that took Jews to the extermination camps in Poland as well. Okay? Some people who collaborate were judges in the legal system. Nazi Germany enacts a whole collection of a variety of different laws that were aimed at isolating Jews, separating them from the non-Jewish population, and making life difficult for them. Well, how are those laws carried out? Somebody has to enforce those laws, right? So police officers are involved, and also judges. And in Germany, they were required to swear an oath of loyalty, not to the German nation, but to Adolf Hitler specifically.
Yeah, I would say that we got rid of the non-Nazi judges and put in Nazi judges so they would go along with it.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, if you didn't hear her comment, she said they got rid of the judges that would not go along. In other words, they wouldn't join the Nazi party, or they wouldn't enforce those laws, and replace them with judges who would. Yeah, that's quite possible. Some were doctors. The medical establishment is closely tied to the Nazi party, and especially when you talk about, so there's a program called the T4 program. It's named after the address of one of the hospitals. Who was it that mentioned the hospitals where they put the disabled? Was that you? So it's named after one particular hospital. It was located on the Tiergartenstrasse, that's a street in Germany. But the T4 program was designed to collect those who had some sort of a mental or physical disability and then exterminate them, murder them. Okay? That required the cooperation of doctors and nurses. This is just one example. Some of you have probably heard of him. Joseph Mengele was the head doctor at the Auschwitz extermination camp. Performed some really nasty experiments on inmates, supposedly in the name of science, but essentially used camp inmates as test subjects for all sorts of horrible experiments. He had help. I mean, he's not doing that all by himself. He had other doctors that supported him as well. Sometimes religious leaders also become collaborators. Right? This is a photograph showing Catholic clerics giving the Nazi salute, and they could be involved and also simultaneously sometimes persecuted as well. I didn't mention that. I mentioned the four groups, okay? Perpetrators, collaborators, bystanders, rescuers. Sometimes an individual might fit into multiple categories, depending on different points in their experience. So they could at one point be a collaborator and another point be a rescuer. And a really great example of that you've probably heard of is Oskar Schindler. So if you've seen Schindler's List, you kind of know his story. Well, he was a member of the Nazi Party. He owned a factory that used Jewish slave labor, and he's profiting from that. So absolutely, he's at least a collaborator. But then at some point, he goes through some sort of transformation and becomes very concerned about saving the lives of the Jewish workers in his factory. So these identifications are not simple. And any one person's experience during the Holocaust could be very complicated and might change, from time to time. You also get local participation from police units, militia units in a variety of different countries who are involved in the mass shootings that take place in 1940, 41, 42, in a whole variety of countries. This photograph was taken in Ukraine, and the guys that you see there with the rifles are not German military. Those are Ukrainian police officers, or there are also some militia members there as well. Anti-Semitism did not exist only in Germany. It existed all throughout Europe, and so in some cases, even though these countries might have been invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany, the Germans were able to find locals who were quite willing to participate in the persecution of Jews, okay, because they were anti-Semitic themselves. Sometimes they had axes to grind. They wanted to even the score. So this was an opportunity for them to, be involved in the persecution and murder of their neighbors in many cases. All right, another question that I often get is, why didn't the Jews leave? The persecution starts in 1933. Nobody's being sent to camps until at least 1938. So why didn't they leave? Again, not a simple answer to that question. First of all, in order to leave, you've got to have some place to go. We're talking about German Jews at this point because the war hasn't started yet. But for German Jews to leave, they had to find a country that was willing to take them. And the simple fact is that most countries in the world had very strict immigration laws that prevented Jews from easily immigrating to someplace else. The United States is one of those. Starting in the 1920s, the United States had enacted a quota system, which meant that per year, we would only accept a certain number of immigrants from each country. And each country had its own quota. Germany had one of the largest quotas, but if you're talking about Eastern European countries, quotas were very, very low. So Jews do try to leave, especially after Kristallnacht in 1938. That's when they begin to realize maybe things are going bad, worse than we thought they were going to be. But at that point, who's willing to take them? And even though there is an international conference that is led by President Roosevelt to try to convince countries to loosen their immigration policies so that Jews could immigrate, escape, nobody was willing to do it, including the United States. No other country was willing to relax their immigration laws to allow Jews to immigrate. The United States at that time also did not have any designation for refugees, right? Everybody's an immigrant. There's no designation for refugees. Nowadays, we have special programs specifically for people who are trying to escape persecution, but that didn't exist in the 1930s, 1940s. Yeah.
I think too, as in the United States, as we were beginning to see evidence of the atrocities and the things that were happening, we still refused to up our quota and let more Jewish people immigrate to our country.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. Did everybody hear what she said?
No.
She said even though in the United States, as the Holocaust proceeds, even though we could see what was happening, it's in the news, you could read about what was happening in the news. Kristallnacht is on the front page of many newspapers throughout the United States. We still did not do anything to relax our immigration laws. Part of that is because anti-Semitism was present here too. It's not just in Europe, right? There was quite a strong anti-Semitic streak here in the United States. There was even an American Nazi party. They held rallies. I've seen photographs of the American Nazi Party holding rallies in Madison Square Gardens, big Nazi swastikas, flags, alongside portraits of George Washington. Very, very weird.
And Lindbergh was a big...
Yes, there is a group in the United States, they were called, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. They were an anti-war group, and one of their most prominent spokespersons was Charles Lindbergh. And he is arguing against the United States getting involved in the war, but he was also anti-Semitic. Henry Ford of Ford Motor Company, also very anti-Semitic. He spent a lot of his own money to publish copies of anti-Jewish propaganda. He even bought several newspapers just so he could publish that in those newspapers. Yeah.
And like you said, at Kristallnacht was when that kind of people were thinking, oh, this is going to get worse. But as early as 1933, if you read about the United States diplomat to Germany, if you read any of his books or his journals, as early as 1933, he started warning our State Department. I mean, he was practically begging on his knees and telling them the Germans are militarizing, they're building planes, they're building tanks, and practically begged our government to pay attention.
the U.S. State Department actually becomes a bit of a stumbling block because they refuse to fill the quotas that we had. I mentioned the quotas that we had for Germany and Austria and a variety of other countries in Europe. Those quotas were never fully filled. So not only do you have long lists, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people on the waiting list trying to get into the United States. We don't even fill the quotas that we had at the time. Did you have a question, sir?
No, not anymore.
Okay, all right. Now, it's also probably worth pointing out that German Jews, they're German citizens. They're a part of the German nation, and so there's not a desire to leave. This is their home. Many of them had served in the German military during World War I, highly decorated. In fact, German Jews served at a higher rate than their representation in the German population overall. And so they're not eager to leave. Even when it does start to get bad, a lot of them said, well, we've seen this before, right? We've seen this kind of discrimination before. You know, it'll be bad for a while, but eventually it'll get better. Hitler won't be here forever, right? And so it's not until Kristallnacht in 1938 that a lot of them finally say, oh, maybe it is getting worse, and maybe we should leave. But by that point, Germany had passed laws making it difficult for them to leave, in addition to the immigration restrictions that they already faced in a variety of different countries around Europe and others. Yes?
Did Germany have a constitution at all?
Yes.
And they just didn't care?
Well, what happens
They didn't
is,
care about the constitution at all back then?
so Hitler comes to power in 1933. He's named, that's not entirely correct. In 1933, he is appointed the chancellor, which is the equivalent of a prime minister. But Germany still had a president. President von Hindenburg was the president. He's the one who decided to invite Adolf Hitler to take that position. And the reason behind that was he was afraid not of the Nazi Party, even though they had been growing in popularity. He's more concerned about the Communist Party in Germany. And he knows that the Nazi Party is like the arch rivals of communists. So his belief was, I'll make Hitler chancellor, we can control him, he will control the communists. 2 years later, he dies. President von Hindenburg dies. And let me back up. After Hitler is named chancellor, there's a mysterious fire that breaks out in the Reichstag, which is the German parliament building. Hitler says it's not Jews, not communists, okay? Because he knows that's what von Hindenburg is most concerned about, right? So he goes to President von Hindenburg and says, I need emergency powers. This is a crisis, right? We're under threat from the communists. You need to give me emergency powers. And so von Hindenburg says, okay. At that point, Adolf Hitler suspends freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association. So anybody that belonged to a political party other than the Nazi Party, he starts to round up, throw them in prison, especially communists and socialists, but others too. And then when Hindenburg dies in 1935, Hitler says, well, we're still in this crisis. We're still having this emergency. So I'm going to take the position of president in addition to chancellor.
And then slowly dismantled it, slowly by slowly?
Yeah, well, at that point, it's no longer a democracy. He rules by edict, right? German parliament basically just rubber stamps anything that he said.
So I might have missed it, but what is that word?
Let me talk about Kristallnacht. Yeah, so is that your question? What is Kristallnacht? Yeah, Kristallnacht, this is an event that takes place in November of 1938. It is an organized campaign of violence in Germany that targeted the Jewish community. So they attacked Jewish businesses, vandalized, looted Jewish businesses. They burned, just about every single synagogue in Germany was burned. And then they rounded up Jewish men, put them in concentration camps, and said, you can't leave until you agree to leave the country, which many of them couldn't do, right? That's known as the Night of Broken Glass, or in German, Kristallnacht. The violence was so widespread and obviously well planned that that's what motivates a lot of Jews at that point to try to get out. But as we said, it's almost impossible for them to get out at that point, right? I wanted to show you, these are the documents that were required by the United States to immigrate, to get a visa, okay? So on top of the fact that we have a quota, there's also all of these requirements that you had to meet before you could even get a visa to come to the United States, okay? You can see there is quite an extensive list of documents. What I think is interesting is you had to get a certificate of good conduct from German police authorities. So the Jews that are being persecuted by the German state are required to go to the German state to get a certificate of good behavior, good conduct, right? The other problem that a lot of them face is you get all of these documents, many of the documents have an expiration date. So if any one of these documents expires and you have not yet been placed on the waiting list, you haven't received a visa, you have to start it all over again. Many Jews get out of Germany, but they go to other European countries, okay? What's the problem with that? Yeah, Hitler invades a lot of these countries in 1939, 1940. And so even Jews that did get out find themselves back in the boiling pot, so to speak, because they immigrated to the Netherlands. That's the case with Anne Frank's family, or Belgium, or France, okay, or one of these other countries. So it's very, very difficult for Jews to leave. All right. Because I'm taking up a lot of time, I'm going to kind of move along. This is another question that I often hear. Why did the Jews resist? There is it's a semi-quote. It's taken out of context. But it's often used by people who want to argue that the Jews didn't fight back. And it goes something like this. The Jews went like lambs to the slaughter. You guys have probably heard a variation of that, right? That actually comes from a letter that was written by a rabbi. His name was Abba Kovner. He is finding out, this is a little bit after the war has started, he's finding out that a lot of the Jews that are being deported, and nobody ever sees them again, he's finding out what's happened to them. They've been sent to Treblinka, they've been sent to Buzets, Majdanek, one of the other extermination camps. And that's what's happening to them. They're being murdered. So he sends a letter back to the ghetto in Warsaw, and in the letter he says, "Let us not go like lambs to the slaughter. Let us fight back." That gets taken, and a lot of people say, oh, they went like lambs, they just walked into the gas chambers, okay? That's not the right question. Why didn't the Jews resist? They did resist in many, many different ways and in many different places. The proper question really is, how could they resist? With all of the disadvantages that they had, how were they able to still resist? And it was widespread. This is part of the story that I think is not often told. There is armed resistance in over 100 different ghettos throughout Europe, Poland, mostly Poland and the Soviet Union. The one that you've probably heard of is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. That's the most famous one, perhaps, but that's not the only one. There were many places. Okay? This shows locations of Jewish armed resistance, either in ghettos or in extermination camps. Okay? You notice that, I don't have a laser pointer, but right here in the middle you see Sobibor, and then right up above that Treblinka. Those are 2 of the 6 extermination camps, 2 locations where there were revolts within the camp. Okay? The inmates that had not been sent to the gas chambers as soon as they arrived got organized, were able to fashion weapons of a sort, and they staged an uprising. Wasn't successful, but they did fight. They did fight back. They did resist. One of my favorite stories of resistance, I hope this is appropriate. There is a Jewish, she was a ballet dancer, very popular, very beautiful. She is sent to one of the extermination camps, and as you probably know the process, they arrive at Auschwitz, they arrive at Buzets, they arrive at Sobibor, Treblinka, and they are required to They have to disrobe, they have to take off all their clothes, any personal objects are taken from them, and then they are sent into the gas chambers. Well, she decides she's going to fight back. And so as she is forced to take off her clothes, she does so in kind of a seductive manner, and she catches the eye of a Nazi guard who happened to be close by, and when he's distracted, she grabs his gun and shoots him. And that led to several other women who were in line attacking the other guards. Now, they all ended up being murdered anyway, but they did resist. They did fight back. Love that story. Okay. You also have Jews that are active in a variety of resistance and underground movements. So, again, you've probably heard this if you've read anything about World War II. In all of the countries that are occupied by Nazi Germany, there was always resistance. There was always underground groups that fought against Nazi occupation. Jews are part of those resistance groups as well. Okay? In France, in particular, they formed their own resistance group. They were called the Armée Juive. Okay? A resistance group, a partisan group, part of the French underground that was made up entirely of Jews, French Jews. Okay? Other national resistance movements in all of those countries there also included Jewish members as well. This is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I mentioned this earlier. Most people are very familiar with the uprising. It occurs over about a month and a half period in 1943. The Jews that remained in the ghetto was being liquidated. In other words, they were deporting all of the Jewish residents in the ghetto. Most of them had already been deported. The only ones that were left were predominantly young people, teenagers, early 20s, and they decided, we know what's happening. We know what has happened to many of our family members. We're going to fight back. And so they organized a fighting organization. Now, let's think about this for a second. How many of you are familiar with the conditions in the ghettos? Just tell me what's going on. What kind of obstacles did they face?
Starvation.
Okay, starvation.
Isolation.
Isolation.
Massive overcrowding.
Very crowded, disease, right?
Starvation.
What would it have taken to put up any kind of a fight against the German military? What would you need? Need a plan? Leadership?
Collective action.
Okay, you got to have enough people who agree that they're going to do that. Weaponry.
Physical strength.
Okay, physical strength. Military training. You got to know if you have weapons, you got to know how to use the weapons, right? Well, how much of that would have been available to them in the ghetto, right? But they still found a way. And they're using Molotov cocktails, they're using grenades, the few that they were able to smuggle in from outside the ghetto. There are some very kind of homemade weapons, guns, pistols, rifles that they have somehow been able to manufacture. And they put up a fight. To the point that the German military, when they go in to liquidate the ghetto, they come up against this resistance and they actually retreat. Now, it doesn't last very long, because again, what did they have available to them, right? But they did put up a fight, and at one point, in one of the buildings are burning, there's smoke and everything, but in one of the tallest buildings, they raised a Polish flag and a Star of David, which anybody would have seen in the city of Warsaw if they had looked up, right? It didn't last very long, but they made a statement, right? Most of them, if they're not killed, they're eventually rounded up and deported along with everybody else from the ghetto at the time. I mentioned uprisings in the camps. Both Treblinka and Sobibor had prisoner uprisings, and then at Auschwitz, they also had an uprising there. The result was usually retribution by the SS. They would not only kill the people responsible for it, but they would round up, 200, 300, 400 other inmates and execute them as well. But they did resist. They did fight back. Okay. There were other forms of resistance. So far, everything I've been talking about is armed resistance, but there's other ways that Jews resisted, particularly in the ghettos. They formed symphonies. They put on plays. They organized libraries, book lending libraries. They tried to organize schools for the kids. All things that were forbidden by the Germans, but they did it anyway and tried to keep it secret. It's what we call spiritual resistance. So I guess it kind of depends on, if you're trying to answer that question, how do you define resistance? We probably think mostly of armed resistance. There was many other ways to resist. All right, we are at about an hour plus. I don't want to go any longer than we are supposed to.
I had it scheduled till 8, so
Okay.
if you want to.
I'm happy to keep talking, but if there are, I want to give you the opportunity perhaps to ask any questions that you might have about things I haven't talked about. Okay?
Someone online said, how did the end of World War I contribute to what led to the Holocaust? So kind of
That's a
going
good
back-
question. Yeah, so let's talk about the ending of World War I. You know how it ends. The British and the French and the Americans are successful. Germany is defeated. The armistice is signed in November of 1918, but then there's about 6 months of peace negotiations to come to a final peace treaty. The result of those negotiations is the Treaty of Versailles. And the provisions of that particular treaty were, some would say, particularly harsh to Germany. They had to accept responsibility for starting the war. They were limited, they lost some territory. They didn't lose some territory, well, they did lose some territory, but the Rhineland, which is the western part of Germany, it's on the border between Germany and France, that had to be completely demilitarized. Their military was limited in size. They couldn't have an air force at all, and then the Army and the Navy was limited in size. But probably most damaging of all of the provisions of the treaty was the war reparations that Germany was forced to pay to Britain and to France mainly. And we're talking billions, tens of billions of dollars. Now that's 1918 money, not 2025 money. So it might not sound like a lot today, but at the time it was quite a financial burden. And then within 10 years, we get the Great Depression. That doesn't only affect the United States, it affects many places around the world, and Germany in particular. You also have drastic political instability. In the years after the war, Germany actually becomes a democracy. But it's a parliamentary system, which means they have multiple political parties. They don't have just kind of two dominant parties like we have, which leads to a lot of chaos because you have so many different political parties. There is kind of riots that break out in the streets all of the time. Then on top of that, the Great Depression hits, inflation goes through the roof, and there is a lot of dissatisfaction amongst the German population about what's happening in their country. So in the late 1920s, when this kind of obscure fringe political party appears called the Nazi Party, it's the National Democratic Workers' Party, I think, Socialist Democratic Workers' Party. Anyway, the acronym in German is Nazi, that's where we get that from. When they start to say, hey, we have the answer to all of these problems. We can fix this. Only we can fix this. They start to attract support. Now, they never at any time gained more than 33%, something like that, 35% of the seats in the German parliament. But at least at one point, they were the largest party in the German parliament, even though they didn't have a majority. Okay? But all of those things that occur at the end of World War I creates this environment where somebody like Adolf Hitler in the Nazi Party, who claims to have all the answers to all the problems, gets the support of the people. And once he does come to power, he comes through on the promises. He does fix things. By 1936, the unemployment in Germany was almost 0%. In the United States, it's close to 25%. right? So he does fix all the problems. He starts to restore German national honor. He rebuilds the military, reoccupies the Rhineland. They're not making the reparations payments anymore. Okay? I hope that answers the question. If there's
So-
more. Yeah.
Talking about the Nazi Party only having a third of votes, bear in mind, Germany has never had a single-party government. They've always had, to this day, coalition governments, which inherently makes it
Except for the Nazi years.
Excuse me, you're right, sorry about that.
I
All
think
other
we
parties
understood
were,
that.
but prior to and
Yes.
after, it was always a coalition, and to this day, and it makes it so you've got this one little guy over here who's brought in to help form it, but he holds an absurd amount of power when
Because
he's
they
just-
need him to make the
to keep the
majority
coalition, keep the coalition.
Yeah, that's right. Other questions? Yeah.
So one of the, I guess, selling points from Hitler, but I forgot the terminology. I don't know German, but pretty much it translates roughly to like living space.
Yes.
What was it called? I forgot.
Lebensraum. It literally does mean living space. Yeah. Do you have a question about it, or do you want me to explain what that
Oh,
means?
no, I mean, I think it'd be nice, like, like the meaning of it and how it, like, pretty much, appeal to the German population, as part of, like, not only giving more space to live and more land for us, but also for pretty much, let's have revenge on Europe after the First World War.
Yeah. Yeah, so Adolf Hitler rises through the ranks of the Nazi Party, and in 1923, they attempt a coup to overthrow the government. Complete failure. He is arrested along with a bunch of other guys, spent some time in prison. While he's in prison, he writes Mein Kampf, which means my struggle, right? And he lays out in that book, this is his manifesto. Here's what I'm going to do once I finally come to power. One of those things was, Germany needs living space, Lebensraum. In order for Germany to be successful, to be thriving, to be strong, it needed to constantly acquire more territory. And he is looking east to Eastern Europe. Why there? Because those are all populated by so-called inferior races. So the plan was, we will eventually acquire the living space that we need in Eastern Europe, and we will either ethnically cleanse those territories, or we will use those inhabitants as slavery. Okay? What's also interesting about that is, where does the majority of Europe's Jews live? In the eastern part of Europe. So as they invade all of these territories, they're acquiring all of these territories that have the largest percentage of Europe's Jews at the same time. That's why they get to the point where they're like, what are we going to do with all of these Jews? We can't deport them. Russia won't take them. What's the alternative? Well, I guess we need to just exterminate them. That's how they finally arrive at what's called the final solution, which is, we're going to gather them all up, deport them off to these camps that we have set up specifically for mass murder on an industrial scale. Other questions?
So, once they find the survivors, I'm fuzzy on what happens next.
Like after the war's over, the
who's
camps are
taking care of where
liberated?
they're going, they can't go home, they don't have the house, they don't have property, they don't have
Yes.
jobs. Where's,
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. That's a good question. The war's over. You have American and British troops that are stumbling on these camps. By the way, it's an entire camp system. We tend to think of Auschwitz and maybe a couple of others, Dachau you've probably heard of. There are 6 extermination centers, but then there are thousands of other camps and subcamps that are mostly labor camps. But those 6 extermination centers were built for one purpose, and that is to exterminate people as quickly and efficiently as possible. Okay? All right, so American and British troops are stumbling as we move into Germany at the end of the war. They're kind of stumbling across all of these camps. They keep finding all of these camps with inmates and so forth. What happens to all of these survivors? A lot of them die soon after liberation, mainly because conditions in the camps have gotten so bad that they are suffering from a whole host of different diseases, malnutrition, and even after they're liberated and we are there to provide medical aid and food, it's too late. A lot of them die, typhus epidemics break out. Anne Frank actually she dies from typhus. She's not sent to a gas chamber. And she dies just a couple of months before the camp where she was is actually liberated. Okay, so that's one obstacle that they face, right? Those who survive those first few months typically were gathered up into displaced person camps. Some of those DP camps remain until the 1950s because they don't have anywhere to go. Some do try to go home, but like you said, what do they go home to? Especially when you're talking about Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, and particularly in Russia, where they tended to live in communities where they were all Jewish. Those communities are gone. They've been erased. There's literally no town to go back to, right?
And they're stateless, they don't have.
Some are stateless, yes. Some do try to immigrate. A lot will end up here in the United States, but even after the end of the war, we still don't change our immigration policies. And so a lot of them are kind of stuck, and that's why they stay in these displaced person camps. Eventually, Great Britain is persuaded to lift the limits on immigration into Palestine, or the British mandate in Palestine, and so you get a lot that immigrate to Palestine, which would later become the state of Israel in 1948. Yeah.
And a lot of the survivors that actually were able to go home, when they get to their home city, there was nothing left for them, and they were murdered by the citizens.
Yes. So, does anti-Semitism end with the end of the Holocaust? No, it does not. And so a lot of survivors, they do try to go back home, and they're met with hostility by the non-Jewish residents who still are there. And they get things like, oh, you're still alive? Why did you come back? Somebody's living in your house now. You know, if you had a house. Plus, a lot of these guys are the sole remaining survivors of their entire family. Right? They've got nobody. So what happens to them? The tragedy continues after the Holocaust is over for a lot of these guys. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah?
So I've heard in the movie and stuff, you said they just stumbled across the camps. I've heard that before, but the general public knows they're getting shipped off and they're not coming back. How do we not know
Yeah. So
what's happening?
Yeah, let's
The
talk
American
about
people or the world, like,
what do Americans know? What is known about what's happening? Stories are leaking out as early as 1941, 42, that the Germans are exterminating Jews in large numbers. And some of the numbers that get thrown around are 1 million, 2 million, 3 million. Generally, even though those stories are appearing in newspapers all across the United States, it's showing up on page 12 or page 7. It's not front page news. And when people do see those reports, most often the response is, oh, that's exaggerated. Right? That's propaganda. It can't really be that bad, right? But if you read some of the accounts of American soldiers that are liberators, they find these camps, they're surprised by what they find because nobody was telling them what was happening. And there's a reason for that. President Roosevelt did not want to widely publicize the reports that he was getting that you have huge numbers of Jews that are being exterminated. And the reason why he didn't want that widely publicized is because he was afraid if that happened, that he would be accused of launching this war to save Jews. Okay, you understand? That's not the motivation that he thought would motivate the American public to support this war, which was very costly in terms of casualties, right? So I'm sorry, that's my phone. It actually came up as robocaller. So he does not want the war to be seen as a war to save Jews. So they're not told. And so in actuality, that is often what happens. They come across a camp. It looks like a prison camp. We don't know who these people are. In some cases it was Jews. In some cases it's people from one of those other persecuted groups. But what I think is inspiring is the response of American and British troops when they find these camps. They do everything they can to help. They bring in medical care as quickly as they can. It's difficult to take care of people who are so advanced in, with disease or malnutrition, starvation, overwork, abuse. So, yeah. Other questions? All right, well, thank you guys for being here.
Matt, hold on.
Oh, one more?
You didn't get this, and my question would be, and I already know the answer, but what was the German mindset that allowed this? The German mindset, and I've seen it because it's my grandmother and her family, Befehl ist Befehl. Orders are orders. If you do what you're told, somebody else higher up tells you to do it, you're safe. You'll be protected. Even if you know it's wrong and you do it, you'll still be okay. Now, these guys in Nuremberg at the trials found out that wasn't the case, but that's the German mentality, and it still is to this day. Now, not as much today, and especially the young people today question everything, but that was the mindset at the time.
Yeah, so this is a really great book. I encourage you to look it up. I don't know if the library has a copy, but Christopher Browning profiles one particular unit. They were a reserve German police unit, so not German army, but they were given the task of carrying out some of the mass shootings that were taking place as Germany is advancing through Eastern Europe and into Russia. And what he finds through his research is none of these guys were psychopaths. None of them were murderous, madmen. They were all very ordinary people who, when placed in a particular situation, certain circumstances, had to make a choice. And most of them chose to go along. Sometimes that's because of peer pressure. Some, in a few cases, they actually seem to enjoy it. But you also have some who refuse to go along. So once again, we see choices are possible because some chose not to, right? And there was no, for those, German military, German police officers, if you refused, some cases you were given the opportunity to opt out if you wanted to. And if you refused to participate, his research shows there was no consequences. They weren't shot. They weren't even kicked out of the military. They were most normally given other responsibilities.
Now, you won't go back, don't need to, but to the slide of the hardcore folks, like the Waffen-SS, they were hardcore fanatics.
Yes.
With absolute loyalty.
True believers.
True believers.
Yep.
And they were volunteers.
Yes, they believed in the Nazi racial ideology, the concept of Lebensraum, the inferior races, Jews are a threat to the purity of our race, and so on and so on. Yes?
Who emerged from the Jewish community as their leaders that brought them together? And I'm thinking of probably after the trials, and more obvious to the world what was going on. And we have the Jewish leaders that then created the migration or created a new state.
I don't know of any leaders that we could say kind of stand out as representative of the entire Jewish, the worldwide Jewish community. I mean, you have certain leaders within specific countries. I think, though, that in the years, because Israel becomes an independent state in 1948, Israel kind of becomes like the beacon that everybody is looking to, not only for Holocaust remembrance, but you still have, for decades after the war's over, an effort to track guys down who participated and had somehow escaped. One of those is Adolf Eichmann. Probably heard of him. There's a lot of books written about him. There's a movie about him, Operation Finale. It's very good. But he is found by the Israeli Secret Service to be hiding out in Argentina under an assumed name. But they locate him, they kidnap him basically, take him out of the country, and bring him back to Israel where he's put on trial. Now, this is significant because this is the first trial of a perpetrator that is televised. This is 1961. You know, this is the first time that one of these trials is televised, and you also have a significant number of eyewitnesses who give testimony at this trial. So for the first time, people are seeing around the world, because they're watching it on TV, they're reading the reports, seeing the photographs and everything. This is really the first time that the Holocaust gets what I would call worldwide public attention. It also does something important because this is the first time that people are seeing Holocaust survivors telling their stories. A lot of Holocaust survivors begin to say, oh, I'll tell my story too. Many of them did not want to tell their story. That's something that they wanted to leave behind, as you might understand, right? But for the first time, so I think at that point, Israel kind of becomes the, like I said, the beacon that people look to for Holocaust remembrance. But you also have a whole variety of Holocaust survivors in a lot of different countries, a lot here in the United States, that are finally talking and telling their story, sharing their experiences. I'm happy to stay as long as you guys want. But I'm not going to be offended if you guys need to leave and you've got other places to go.
So the crimes against humanity, how far did they go with the leadership down before they said, okay, you're not held accountable? Like,
yeah, so there are a whole series of trials that take place in the years after the war. You're all familiar with the Nuremberg trials. That was just one set of trials, but there are other trials that take place in Germany, in other countries, including Israel. I just mentioned that one, Adolf Eichmann. But the first trial that is held, they wanted to put leaders on trial that kind of were senior leaders, number one, but kind of represented a cross-section of the infrastructure that made this possible, right? So obviously Adolf Hitler is not put on trial. He commits suicide before the war ends. Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS and kind of ran the camp system, also commits suicide. Joseph Goebbels, the number 2 man, you could probably argue, in the Nazi Party. Number 3, he commits suicide. Well, he kills his children, kills his wife, and then commits suicide. So those 3 guys never really faced justice, right? But then you get a whole variety of different guys representing different parts of the Nazi Party, the German government, that are being put on trial for the Nuremberg trials. Then there are trials that come later that start to go down the hierarchy, right? And you're getting lower and lower level leaders and others who participated. One of the things that they did for the Nuremberg trials that I thought was pretty smart, they not only indicted, that's to charge somebody with a crime, they not only indicted individuals for crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, and so forth, they also indicted organizations. So they indict the Waffen-SS, they indict the German military, the Wehrmacht, they indict a whole variety of different organizations who participated in the Holocaust. Now the reason why I think that's smart is, in the future, all you had to prove was this particular person was a member of that organization that has already been indicted. Does that make sense? So that allows them, I mean, we get into as late as the 1990s, I think 1998 is the last one that I remember, of an old, he was 90-something years old, he's living here in the United States under assumed name. Turns out he was a camp guard at one of the camps.
Was that the guy in Ohio? The auto
I don't
worker?
remember all the details, and there's been more than one. But it just goes to show, number one, there's no statute of limitations on the crimes committed in the Holocaust. And we'll go down the hierarchy as far as we can. Yeah.
But how about all of the scientists and things that America decided we want them?
Yeah.
They were so rotten. How about the scientists that were involved in the space program?
Yeah, not,
nuclear weapons.
it-
Let's bring them to America and let them live a good life and pay their salary and they'll make
doesn't
these things.
redound to our credit, does it?
No. It's
However, I think it's important to understand why. Why were we so interested in getting these scientists and it had more to do with the state of the world after the war. The Cold War's begun. Now our big adversary is not Nazi Germany, it's the Soviet Union. And we're engaged in this space race, but also nuclear arms race. And so the decision that we made is, yes, these guys are tainted, but we really need their knowledge and expertise because what we care about now is the Soviet Union.
It's kind of hard, you know, how does humanity, how can you make that decision when you know the majority of them were involved in the creation of the cyclone gas that gassed on these millions of people? I don't know if I could even make that decision. I don't know how the leadership
It's a
collectively.
really difficult moral decisions that you have to make.
Super moral decision, super.
And I think a lot of it too, not just scientific innovations, but also like warfare innovations. I mean, wasn't it before the First War? Maybe after, I don't know, but the planes, like they didn't think about using them as weapons until they actually did. Or even as gruesome as it may sound, I mean, if it weren't because of the torture scientific experiments, not only in Germany, but so I've heard in Japan, like Japanese Empire.
Yep.
That's the reason why we know how much water what we're composed of, water-wise, like a percentage of how much we're made of. Like, and I'm not going to go into detail. If you want to look it up, you can. But there's some experiments where we have actually learned a lot of things because of that inhumane experiments.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, that's correct. Yes?
unfortunately.
One of the things too I've heard a lot about World War II, a lot of people thought that Germany declared war on the United States after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Germany thought we declared war on Germany. We did Japan, and they thought we declared war on Germany after Pearl Harbor. But Hitler actually declared war on the United States. So that's how we ended up in the Pacific theater and the European theaters.
Correct.
Hitler was stupid enough, thankfully, to declare war on our country, as well as stupid enough to break the Iron Pact agreement that he had with Stalin. It's two major mistakes.
Yeah. I think we were headed in that direction anyway. President Roosevelt really did want to come to the aid of Great Britain. They were the last man standing in Europe by 1940. He just needed a reason.
But then too,
Japan
everybody was still smarting from World War I. I mean, you
Yes.
know, it's like in America, we don't
Yeah.
want to go over in Europe and fight their wars again and have more of our people killed and all that
Right.
stuff, and that you can understand.
This is how my brain works. The thing that I couldn't remember the name of an hour ago now suddenly pops into my head. It was the America First Committee.
Yeah.
This was the group that was very opposed to the United States getting involved in the war. Their spokesperson was Charles Lindbergh. He traveled around the country talking about it. If you ever want, I mean, this is quite a rabbit hole, but those of you who are Dr. Seuss fans, he was actually a very active political cartoonist during the 1930s, 1940s, and he drew a lot of political cartoons in his very distinctive style. You'll know it as soon as you see him, criticizing the America First Committee and Charles Lindbergh specifically because he felt like, you know, this was a moral issue. You can't ignore, you know, what's happening in Europe.
I find it really interesting that in the political campaign between Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie was the very pro, hey, we got to get over there and help. Roosevelt's campaigning on, he kept us out of war. But at the very same time, he's doing the Lend-Lease and all the other stuff in the background, knowing and
Doing the
starting.
best he can to get around the laws that Congress
Yes.
passed to prevent us from.
And he was very good at
Yeah.
that, yeah, circumventing the law in a lot of ways. But, yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
But then you've got the examples of our own camps. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. The example in America, we set up our own camps for Japanese Americans that we rounded up and put in internment camps, took all their properties, all their businesses, out of fear. Fortunately, German camps. Right, but fortunately, no, they didn't do a German camp, yeah. So that's really fascinating history as well. If you've read about any of those internment camps or what the Asian or Japanese Americans went through.
You had a question?
I just wanted to bring a personal perspective because sometimes to me it feels like the Holocaust happened far away a long time ago because we seem to have moved forward in some areas. Now I don't know if it's true today, but I grew up in France. And so it's not that far from me. And my grandmother was still alive, was born in 1937. So she was a kid, and she grew up in eastern France, the part that used to belong to Germany and France again and all that.
Alsace.
Alsace,
So
right?
when yeah. And so when I asked her, what do you remember about the war? She was a kid, but she remembers seeing the Germans in the streets. And it's a small town, so there weren't any big movement, but she remembers that. And just today I realized if she was Jewish, I wouldn't be here. And it's kind of moving to feel like just a race, like it feels so unfair. She was Catholic, so like it didn't impact my family, but
She's-
wow, my grandmother, like it's not that far.
Other questions, comments? Yes?
I was going to ask, how come whenever we learn about the Holocaust that we overlook how people were living against the Germans?
The Jewish resistance or just resistance in
Just
general?
resistance, how come it was overlooked whenever we learn about it?
I don't know, because it's a really great story. I was going to say people just don't care about that story, but I mean, if you're going to make a movie about it, that would be a great movie. And there's great examples that I gave, you know, of resistance. I don't know why. I wish more of the stories of resistance was told, of all types, not just the armed resistance, but the spiritual resistance as well. How do those who survived the camps, how did they survive? Well, they found a way to resist. And it might not have been armed resistance, but they found a way to hang on to their humanity, to hang on to something that, you know, gave them a reason to continue day after day after day. Yeah.
Why did the Germans do the whole Holocaust thing?
It comes back to that idea of there are superior races and inferior races, and for the superior races to survive, they have to dominate the inferior races. I think that, you know, that's probably a more complicated answer, I guess, but it's this identification of those who are like us and those who are not like us, and we're going to make sure that those of us like us are the ones who are in charge. And that can lead you to do some really horrible things if you have that belief, right, that you're better than somebody else for whatever reason, religious reasons, ethnic reasons, gender. I mean, you can expand that to all sorts of different categories, right? Kim, I'll keep going.
I think, yeah, well, we're at 8, so I think we can wrap up. If you have anything you want to
I would just, once again, let me tell you about it, to finish things off, let me tell you about an experience I had at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Those of you who've been there, you might remember there's a part of the museum where you walk through and they have this large collection of shoes. These are all shoes that were taken from Holocaust victims, right? And they have this very large collection of shoes. They're all the same color, black, whatever. And I was there one day, and I'm just kind of looking at the shoes and thinking about, you know, everything that I've experienced, everything that I'm learning, and so forth. And I noticed that among all of those black shoes, there was this one tiny little white shoe, obviously a child's size. And that's when it dawned on me that this is something that happened to individuals. We throw these huge numbers out there, 6 million Jews, millions of others. And that's very hard for your brain to make sense of. And so what I would encourage you to do, if you're going to, you know, continue to be interested in this particular topic, you want to learn more about it, and that is to find personal testimony from people like Ben Lesser and others, sharing their experiences, because that's when you start to realize that this is not the murder of 6 million people. It's murder that occurred 6 million times, one after another, after another, after another. And every single one of those people had people they loved, hobbies, plans for the future, and all of that was snuffed out. And so personalize it, right? Learn the stories of individuals. I think it will be much more meaningful to you in that regard. Thank you for being here. Again, I apologize, Ben Lesher wasn't here.